and I'm very excited to introduce our speaker today. As the manatee biologist for Save the Manatee Club, Tiare or TJ, Fridrich works to protect manatees and their aquatic habitats by collaborating with stakeholders statewide, advocating for stronger protections at all government levels, leveraging the best available science to guide conservation efforts, and improve management strategies by addressing gaps in data collection efforts and public education. TJ leads the Guardian Guides program, a voluntary training program for manatee ecotourism operators that promote manatee stewardship and aims to minimize disturbances from commercial manatee viewing activities while encouraging education and conservation. TJ holds a Bachelor of Science in Marine Biology from the University of Rhode Island and a Master of Professional Science in Tropical Marine Ecosystem Management from the University of Miami. So please let's welcome TJ, and we're excited to hear what you have to say today. Thank you.
Unmute first. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. I am the manatee biologist for Save the Manatee Club, and today I'll be talking about conserving manatee warm water habitat networks. So a little bit about Save the Manatee Club. We are a nonprofit established in 1981 by Jimmy Buffett and former Senator Bob Graham. And our mission is to protect manatees and their aquatic habitat for future generations. We do this through a lot of different ways, mainly increasing public awareness and education by presenting to you all today, funding research, rescue, rehab, and release of manatees, advocating for strong protection measures and taking legal action when appropriate, and supporting international conservation efforts. There are 3 species of manatees in the world, and we have partners all over the globe, and we help support their conservation efforts. So what is a manatee? Manatees are large, slow-moving aquatic or marine mammals, sometimes referred to as marine mammals, but manatees live in both fresh and saltwater habitats. They're warm-blooded, breathe air, give live birth, and they nurse their young, and they have hair. Every single one of the hairs on a manatee's body is a sensory hair called vibrissae, and they use these vibrissae to feel water currents and to investigate dimly lit environments. They're generalist herbivores, so they eat over 60 different species of aquatic plants, but the majority of their diet comes from aquatic grasses, seagrass, and eelgrass. The strongest social bond in the manatee world is between the mother and the calf. Mother-calf pairs stay together for up to 2 years, and during that time, a calf will learn all the different locations that manatees will travel to. They'll slowly be weaned off of grasses and off of milk and onto grasses. And after around 2 years, they will separate and go their separate ways. And manatees are protected federally and statewide. Manatees live all over Florida in a variety of different habitats. We see them in rivers, bays and estuaries, canals, and springs. But what a lot of people don't realize is that manatees, anywhere a manatee can travel from the coast inland, is accessible to manatees. So anywhere essentially you can boat, you can find manatees. So manatees and boaters share the waterways. Florida has over 3,000 navigable miles of coastline, and manatees access all of these habitats and regularly travel between fresh and saltwater habitats. It's very common to go to a spring and see a manatee with barnacles still on them, and as they're in fresh water, the barnacles will fall off. Some waterways in Florida are blocked by structures like dams, gates, or locks, and these areas are not accessible to manatees. Manatees and boaters share our waterways. So manatees use travel corridors to swim between their main habitats. These travel corridors largely overlap with boater waterways and navigable waterways. There are a lot of characteristics that make manatees vulnerable to collisions and injuries by boat strikes. They feed on aquatic plants, which grow in shallow water or along the edges of the shoreline. So they're typically swimming in shallow areas that it's difficult to get deep in very quickly. Because of their body shape, the way that their lungs are situated in their body, their lungs run the length of their back, and it makes them swim horizontally. So that makes them likely to be hit perpendicularly while they're swimming. They only breach the water with their nose when they're coming up for a breath. So if they're in turbid or murky waters, it can be difficult as a boater to see manatees in the waterway. They don't have as many vertebrae as other mammals do, cervical vertebrae. So they're actually not able to turn their heads to look behind them. So they have to turn their entire body around to see what direction a sound underwater is coming from. So that can make it difficult for them to figure out what direction a sound is coming from and move out of the way. And even though they can burst at speeds up to 18 miles per hour, they typically move in very slow movements. So they're not known to be particularly fast, and they're not faster than a speeding motorboat. So all of these things can make it difficult for manatees to avoid boats and makes it more likely for them to be hit by a boat. Boat strikes are the largest human-related cause of death for manatees in Florida, with an estimated 25% of the yearly mortality coming from boat strikes. And over 96% of all manatees in Florida have at least one boat scar. The best way to protect manatees from boat strikes is to boat slow. It gives manatees time to figure out what direction a sound is coming from and move into deeper water. It gives boaters the ability to react. And if a manatee is hit by a boat, the force is significantly reduced and causing less damage to the animal. In Florida, we have manatee protection zones, and these are zones established by FWC, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, the state government, and local governments to restrict the speed and operation of vessels where necessary to protect manatees from harmful collisions with vessels and from harassment. So these manatee protection zones provide limited safe havens for manatees in areas where they're known to feed, rest, reproduce, give birth, or nurse, so that they can do this undisturbed by human activity. In order to have these zones created, there needs to be significant data showing that manatees are using this area, because you can't have manatee protection zones everywhere. It needs to be distinct to where it would provide the most protection for manatees. FWC is authorized to create these zones under the Florida Manatee Sanctuary Act, and this act declared the entire state of Florida as a sanctuary for manatees, regardless of whether they're protected under the Endangered Species Act or not. So this is a blanket protection for manatees at the state level. And this act allowed FWC to regulate the boat speeds and to protect manatees in areas where they're most frequently sighted. And these boating zones also protect manatee travel corridors when they're traveling between habitats. Manatees migrate seasonally. And so what do we mean by that? So in the wintertime, manatees gather all throughout the state of Florida at warm water sites, the most popular being Crystal River and Blue Spring State Park. A lot of you might be familiar with those areas. Why are manatees gathering there in large numbers? What are special about these areas, especially springs? Well, manatees are actually adapted for the tropics. Despite their size and their shape, manatees don't have nearly as much body fat as other marine mammals do. They actually have an incomplete layer of blubber that surrounds their body. So they have difficulty maintaining their own body temperature in cold water. When water temperatures drop below 68 degrees Fahrenheit, manatees can get cold stress. So this photo here is what cold stress can look like. They can get bleaching on their face and pecs. Essentially, the blood is shunted away from their extremities to protect their internal organs. They can get white lesions on their body. Typically, they might bleed or have sores. They'll be lethargic, so it's common to see a manatee with cold stress be resting in an area for multiple days in a row that you wouldn't expect manatees to be, like an area where they're easily harassed or close to boats, things that look a little strange. They typically have a compromised immune system, and manatees in the wintertime are always at threat of getting cold stress because the waters are cold. So manatees need warm water in order to survive the winter, and they'll gather at these sites because, especially springs, they stay at 72 degrees year round. So manatees know that they can gather there and stay warm even when the ambient water temperature has dropped. They have high site fidelity. So manatees are going back to the same warm water sites year after year. And as I said before, manatee calves will stay with their mom for up to 2 years. And during that time, the calves will learn the warm water sites that the mother uses. And over time, you'll end up with subpopulations of animals that are going to the same springs. It's common for some animals to visit multiple warm water sites, but be visiting the same ones over the course of a winter. And a lot of it has to do with how warm the site stays in the wintertime, what kind of capacity there is, and if there's food nearby. And then when the water warms up in Florida, manatees can leave these warm water sites and disperse throughout the state, throughout all of those waterways, and even go into neighboring states, all the way over to Texas or as far north as Massachusetts. So this is a map of the primary range of the West Indian manatee. The West Indian manatee has two subspecies, the Florida manatee, which is ours, and the Antillean or the Caribbean manatee. And as you can see here, most of the Caribbean manatee range is actually closer to the equator. So these animals really are adapted for the tropics. And the other species of manatees are, their range is around the equator as well. So up here in Florida, we're actually at the northernmost part of the West Indian manatee's range. In Florida, we have 4 manatee management units. Essentially, there are areas that of the state where manatees are expected to kind of stay, keep their home range. So on the Atlantic coast, manatees tend to stay on the Atlantic coast and don't typically go around the southern tip of Florida. So we consider manatees as East Coast or West Coast animals. And then you have the Upper St. Johns region, because you're having manatees go back to Blue Spring every single winter, the Northwest and the Southwest region. We actually do have manatees that travel from the Indian River Lagoon all the way up into the St. Johns River up in Jacksonville and travel all the way down to Blue Spring. And we're seeing tagged animals moving between these habitats. There are 3 main types of warm water refuges for manatees: natural springs, thermal basins, which are areas that are heated by the sun or stay warm because of a density difference, say if there's fresh water on top of salt water, or sometimes there's some type of mud at the bottom of the canal, and the mud can be heated and then it stays warm, and you'll actually see manatees climbing in the mud to stay warm. And then we have artificial sources of warm water, such as power plants. So what is a spring? It's important to understand what a spring is, because in Florida, most of our springs are under threat. So in Florida, we have the Floridian aquifer beneath our feet, and the soil is made of limestone that has holes in it. And when it rains, the water is able to percolate down through the sediment into the aquifer, and it's purified through that process. And so all of the fresh water that we use in Florida comes from the Floridan aquifer, which is huge. So big in some areas that scuba divers can go in, like in the bottom picture, and explore these locations. And in areas where the aquifer is under pressure and there's a hole up to the surface, that's where you get a spring. We have over 1,000 springs in Florida, the most in the country, and almost all of those are in the Northwest Florida, North Central Florida region. So actually on the Atlantic coast of Florida, we don't have any primary warm water sites that are springs. Manatees on the Atlantic coast of Florida depend upon power plants, thermal basins, and moving further south in order to stay warm in the wintertime. Manatees are vulnerable during cold weather. So what does that mean? Manatees typically feed for 6 to 8 hours a day. Because they're herbivores, they don't get a lot of nutrients from their food. So they need to eat pretty much constantly in order to maintain their body weight, and the digestion process actually produces heat for them. When the temperatures drop in Florida, manatees must choose between staying at that warm water site and staying warm, or going out and finding food. And it is common during periods of extremely cold weather, like a cold snap, that manatees will choose to stay at the warm water site versus going to find food. So a lot of manatees do lose weight or become lean during the wintertime. A lot of our warm water sites in Florida, because they are springs or they're in imperiled habitat, they actually don't have food nearby. So manatees are having to travel further than they would historically in order to find food. For example, in Crystal River, more recently, there have been hurricanes that have impacted the grasses that are available there. So manatees typically could leave the springs and immediately go into the bay and find food. And now they're having to travel all the way downriver and even out offshore to access those seagrass beds in order to find food. So they're spending longer periods of time away from that warm water site and being exposed to cold. So it's super common in the wintertime to see manatees have cold stress, but every single winter there are some subset of animals that need to be rescued specifically for this. And as we see more springs and estuaries in decline, we're going to see this become more likely. Manatees at warm water sites are also likely to be harassed by paddlers, swimmers, and boaters. And at some warm water sites, there is no human activity allowed, like in the refuges in Crystal River or around the power plants in the wintertime, where no boaters or anyone can have access. 66% of all manatees in Florida depend upon artificial sources of warm water in order to survive the wintertime. Most power plants in Florida were built before the 1970s, and they weren't built to last forever. At some point, these power plants are going to come offline or be repowered, and some already have. When power plants were originally built, they weren't built to provide warm water to manatees. Excuse me. So it wasn't originally the plan to build these power plants to provide warm water to manatees. It became a nuisance attractant for them. But over time, manatees have shifted their historical habitat further north in the winter to favor power plants. And we've developed a lot of the natural warm water sites they might have had, such as upwelling from groundwater and things like that. Some power plants are completely underneath concrete. Some springs are completely underneath concrete. So a lot of their natural habitat has been developed. So now we're at the point where we've had manatees habitat developed and their range shift over time, and we're seeing power plants come offline. And if power plants were to suddenly come offline without a plan, we would see significant declines in the population. We'd see mass mortality. So there is a need to shift dependence away from these artificial sources and protect natural habitat, but also protecting the manatees that are currently using the habitat until we get to the point where we can safely bring these plants offline. And so a lot of you might be familiar with the unusual mortality event, but if you're not, there is a power plant in Cocoa Beach in the Cocoa area, Cocoa Titusville, called the Cape Canaveral Energy Center. And around 1,000 manatees will use this every winter. It's a primary warm water site for them. And historically, there were lush seagrass beds in the Indian River Lagoon. The Indian River Lagoon is 156 miles long. It's critical habitat for manatees. They're there every winter. They're there in the summer. But what we were seeing starting back in the 2010s is harmful algal blooms and overgrowth of algae from nutrients recurring pretty much every other summer, every other season, to the point where the grasses were being completely shaded out from the light. When harmful algal blooms, when they eventually die, they sink down to the bottom of the lagoon and they smother everything. And then they decompose as well, adding more nutrients to the system. And so you get this cycle of eutrophication where there's nutrients being added in the system and they're fueling these harmful algal blooms. And between 2010 and 2020, there was a loss of over 45,000 acres of seagrass in the Indian River Lagoon, to the point where in 2020, a lot of areas were completely barren with no coverage at all. So manatees were not able to find food, but they were still going back to the same warm water site winter after winter. So they were going to the Cape Canaveral Energy Center and not finding food. And what we ended up seeing were manatees starting to die in large numbers from starvation. That started in December of 2020. We were seeing animals with severe emaciation dying in very large numbers, and it was determined that the cause of death was due to recurrent algal blooms in the IRL, leading to significant losses of seagrass. A lot of animals were actually moving into the Blue Springs, St. John's area where there was seagrass because there wasn't any seagrass in the IRL. The nearest seagrass would have been down in the St. Lucie estuary or even further south. And even then, it's not a lot of grass. In 2021, over 1,000 animals died, and there were 800 in 2022 that died. On average, you're typically seeing around 500 that die a year. So this was almost double what was typical. And we saw a loss of over 12% of the entire Atlantic coast population of manatees in just 1 year. So we were having animals dying in large numbers, particularly in the northern Indian River Lagoon area, which is where the Cape Canaveral Energy Center is located. So U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, FWC, and the Cape Canaveral Energy Center staff worked together to provide food to starving manatees in the northern IRL in the winter of 2021. This is completely unprecedented. It had never happened before, anything like it, to go out and feed wild animals. But at this point, we have a lot of facilities that will take sick manatees, and they were completely full. The SeaWorld takes a lot of animals to help them recover, and they had to set up supplementary tanks, and those tanks were full to the point where we just could not rescue all of the animals that were sick. So in order to handle this situation, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, FWC, and the Energy Center worked together to provide food during the wintertime. So this was a small scale limited feeding trial where there were researchers on deck taking notes, collecting data, figuring out what animals were there. And it also gave them the opportunity to have their eye on the sickest animals because they were all gathering in this intake area at the power plant, as you can see in the bottom left photo. So you actually have some tagged animals, animals that have been returned to the wild and fitted with a tracker to see how they're doing, that were in there as well. And they were feeding the animals within those squares so that the extra lettuce that they were being fed wouldn't just float away and provide additional nutrients. So it was all very well done. And it was estimated there were up to 800 manatees at one time when they were doing the feeding trial. The first trial ended in March of 2022, and then there was another trial in 2023. And then between that and 2024, we actually saw seagrass come back. So there hasn't been another trial following that. So the unusual mortality event, which is a federal designation for when you see a significant number of animals dying in a short period of time without reason that is immediately unexplained. Eventually, that was closed in March of 2025. They hadn't seen another animal die from starvation as they had during the UME in 2 years. So they closed the event, saying that that specific cause of that mortality was over. And it is over. There has been regrowth of seagrass throughout the Indian River Lagoon, but it is patchy in some areas. It's slow to return. We first saw it in the Mosquito Lagoon, and the thought is that there might have been a seed bank underneath the sediment because seagrass can grow through seeds, but they didn't know the seeds were there. And there's been a lot of work being done in Brevard County to improve water quality and in other counties around the Indian River Lagoon. And so this improvement in water quality allowed the seeds to germinate and produce seagrass. So there's significant seagrass in the Mosquito Lagoon, and we're seeing a lot of animals going up in there feeding, over 700 animals at a time. These animals are in good body condition, and we're also starting to see an increase in the number of calves. During the actual mortality event, we weren't seeing new calves being born, which is expected. It takes a lot of energy for manatees to have calves to carry them to term. So we wouldn't have expected to see calves. And now that there are, that shows that the population is likely starting to recover. But it's important to remember that the animals that are in the Mosquito Lagoon that are feeding, these represent what is left of a essentially decimated population. So it's incredibly important that we're protecting these animals that are using the site. There are multiple groups working throughout the Indian River Lagoon to restore the Indian River, to restore seagrass, to go out and do clam plantings. And there's a network of seagrass nurseries that has been started under the IRL, the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program, that is doing a lot of funding. And these groups are growing seagrass so that they can go out and plant it back into the lagoon. FWC is doing aerial surveys and health assessments where they go out and they look at the body condition, take blood, and look at how the animals are doing as a whole so we can keep a better eye on the population. But there continues to be a need to protect their natural habitat. And because manatees were dependent upon the power plant, they weren't going to other areas that maybe would have had food nearby, like further south in the Indian River Lagoon. We want to shift that dependence away from power plants in the long term. So how can we do that? The Florida Manatee Warmwater Habitat Action Plan was first written back in the early 2000s, but in 2020 it was updated. And this document explains all of the warm water sites that manatees go to, the history of it, the power plants, and what the plan is for long-term and short-term goals for maintaining this warm water network that manatees are traveling between all over this state. And very recently, we started meetings of regional partnership teams. So these are teams of experts that know the habitats for the different regions. We split the Atlantic into the North and South region because it's so big. And manatees are doing different things in the northern part of the Atlantic versus the southern part. But we have members of different government agencies, nonprofits, universities that are all working together to help to understand manatee habitat and maybe identify new sources of warm water for them and potentially even build them if it comes to that. But this is something that has been going on for about a year now. And it's been really wonderful to work with all of these different groups and identify these habitats. And but what does identifying a potential warm water site look like? So when you consider what sites they're currently using, You need to think about, is there grass nearby? If we were to enhance a habitat here, restore the shoreline, or improve access, is there food nearby? Do we want manatees to go there in higher numbers? Is there boating protection areas? Is there a pollution source nearby? Is there a lot of runoff? How close is the nearest boat ramp to this location? Would we be enhancing a habitat that's right next to a marina? We wouldn't want to do something like that. Is there human access, and are manatees regularly harassed at these areas? And also considering any project like this would need to be funded. So is there funding for it? Who would fund it? Who owns the land? Is there additional interest in restoring these areas? So as a group, we can all work together to identify these things and work towards improving their habitat. One location of a habitat that's been proposed for restoration is Linda Pedersen Park on the west coast of Florida. This is a lesser known site that's south of Weeki Wachee, and manatees do rest in this location, but the spring itself has a lot of sediment. As you can see in the bottom left picture, at low tide, it's very shallow, and you can see the erosion of the bank there. So an improvement project would potentially look like pulling the extra sediment out of there. There is an artificial beach at this location, so that can be one of the reasons that there's a lot of sand in here, but also just this is a very tidal area. You also have, there's no way for boats to get in here, but kayakers can launch nearby and paddle over the manatees. So if you were to improve this site, you'd want more signage, more education, things like that. But these are the kind of things we think about when we're looking for a site to restore. And if you happen to know of a site, or you work with a group that has a site that you know manatees use and could be restored, please reach out to us. We'd love to talk to you and get some communication going. There's some additional habitat restoration initiatives going on. In 2021, the Indian River Lagoon NOAA Restore Grant for FWC to restore manatee habitat throughout the state and be a part of the Indian River Lagoon Seagrass Nursery Network. It's really cool about seagrass is they can actually grow through fragmentation. So if the grass breaks off, you can stick it back in the sand and it'll grow. So that's one of the easy ways that you can help to grow seagrass like in the nursery system along with seeds, but seeds is a lot more difficult of a process. There's been additional habitat restoration funding. In 2024, the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program was given a $9.4 million grant to do habitat restoration at a huge community level throughout the Indian River Lagoon, and there's a lot of different organizations that are part of that grant. There's $50 million for springs restoration funding, and multiple different groups that are out there doing habitat restoration consistently, helping to improve this habitat. Something I want to bring to your attention is one of these areas that is not accessible to manatees. So some of you might be familiar with the Rainbow River. The Rainbow River is an absolutely gorgeous first magnitude spring system, and it's full of eelgrass. It would be a wonderful manatee habitat. But back in the 1960s, the Cross Florida Barge Canal was being proposed to be built, essentially a canal that would bisect the state of Florida. And that project eventually did go defunct, but a couple of different locks and dam systems were already built before that system went defunct. And one of those is the Inglis Dam. And this prevents manatees from accessing the Rainbow River. They cannot get past this location at all. And so there's this beautiful habitat that manatees cannot access at all. And the Ocklawaha is very similar. The Ocklawaha River is another area that would need to be restored in order for manatees to access it. So this is something that is recently going through legislature right now. It's a very big topic, so some of you might have heard of it. But the Ocklawaha River is the principal tributary of the St. Johns River. You can see in this map here, manatees will actually swim along the East Coast and go up through Jacksonville and swim all the way down the St. Johns River. And there's quite a few springs along that river that manatees depend upon. Or they can go off to the west in the Ocklawaha River. The Ocklawaha River eventually connects to the Silver River, which is a very common warm water site for manatees in the wintertime. So you can see that there is the Rodman Reservoir in the upper right-hand corner and the Kirkpatrick Dam. These were created as part of the Cross Florida Barge Canal. So manatees that want to access the Ocklawaha River actually need to be let through the Buckman Lock. So the lock tender there are really great about seeing manatees and letting them through and collecting data on that. But manatees are only able to access Silver Springs because the lock tenders let them through the lock. But there's still about 20 sunken springs in the lower Ocklawaha River that are completely inaccessible to manatees because they can't get past the dam. So very recently, the Florida legislature passed its 2025 budget, which included funding to start the restoration. But unfortunately, Governor DeSantis did not approve the funding. So we're going to continue to fight for this effort. And there's quite a few individuals and different groups that are interested in having this area restored. And if you're interested, you can find information on how to contact him online and let him know that you wish he had approved the funding so that we can get this area restored. And then we're also continuing to look at manatee warm water habitat through the lens of the Endangered Species Act. Manatees are protected by the Endangered Species Act, and under any animal that is listed as part of the Endangered Species Act needs to have designated critical habitat. So these are areas that if the federal government were to do any type of construction that would potentially harm that habitat that's critical for that listed species, they would need to work with other federal agencies and consult on that project. So they can't just go ahead and do that and potentially destroy habitat. So for manatees, they were originally listed in the 1970s as endangered, and they were downlisted to threatened in 2017. But in that time, the critical habitat had not been updated for the manatee from the last time it was updated was when they were originally listed. So manatee critical habitat, we had asked U.S. Fish and Wildlife to update the critical habitat, and we eventually did have to sue to get them to do that. But they did propose new critical habitat for manatees. And so we made sure to review that and make sure that it includes all of the important warm water habitat. And we are waiting to hear back on comments on that, but they did propose new habitat, which we are happy to see. And it's a quick topic. So I'd love to hear your questions about protecting warm water habitat networks. And thank you for coming to this presentation.
Excellent. Thank you so much, TJ. That was great. If anybody has any questions, you can drop them into the Q&A and I can read them out loud, and then hopefully get some answers. So I can start off. This is probably not the best question to start with. I give a lot of talks to the communities about the IRL. And there's always a manatee hater in the crowd, unless it's another environmental group. What are some of your answers that you give to people who think that getting rid of the manatees are going to be the solution to our seagrass problems?
Yes, we hear that as well. So the first one is that manatees essentially evolved in Florida alongside eelgrass and seagrass. So they are part of the habitat, and we had no issue with seagrass here before we started developing it, and all of our nutrients from agriculture and septic tanks and runoff started going into these systems and causing that degrade of the habitat. So manatees have been here much longer than people, and there had never been a problem before. They also, the way that they feed it, they cut the grass blades and it encourages new growth. So in a lot of marine habitats, disturbance is a huge part of keeping things healthy. Like in a healthy ecosystem, coastal habitats, salt marshes, they're experiencing hurricanes yearly. That's how they've evolved to exist through disturbance. And them snipping the grasses when they eat them encourages plants to put out new growth. Any of us who have had houseplants will know that you trim back a plant and it puts out new growth. And a lot of times these grasses have algae on them before they're eaten, and then they're able to put out new grass blades without that algae, and they photosynthesize better. So also manatee slow speed zones protect our habitats, not just manatees, but they protect seagrasses from erosion from boats and from boat scars. They protect the shoreline and mangroves, and all of those things are important for protecting our recreational and commercial fisheries because they depend upon those habitats too. It's not just about the manatees. There are so many other species that depend upon our habitats here.
Great, thank you. All excellent points, and I'll put them in my repertoire. Okay, we have a couple of questions that have come in. One is about feeding manatees. Can you go over rules and regulations for feeding manatees when we're out of the water?
Sure, absolutely. So it is illegal to provide manatees with food and water under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And the reason for that is the Marine Mammal Protection Act protects marine mammals from harm. And harm is anything that could injure a wild population or otherwise disturb them. And harassment is part of that. So when anything that changes a manatee's natural behavior is considered harassment, and providing them with food and water is changing their natural behavior. Manatees are very good at finding their own food and finding their own water, and we don't need to be providing them with food and water. We also providing them with food and water encourages them to come up to people, and the biggest threat to manatees is people, is boat strikes and harassment. And the sound of a running freshwater hose is the same sound that the back of a boat engine makes when water comes out of that. So we don't want to be encouraging manatees to come up to boats, to come up to people. It changes their natural behavior.
Thank you. I did not know that about the sound of running water. Cool.
Yeah, and
Um,
to add too, when the idea of doing provisioning, feeding manatees at the Cape Canaveral Energy Center originally came up, it was out of necessity. But one of the first questions was, how can we do this legally with the way that the law is written? Because we're not allowed to provide food and water to manatees. So they had to get a special permit, and it was all very strictly done with the different federal agencies and state agencies that were a part of that, because it's not something that the public should do or can do. This was specifically because we had so many animals that were needing to be rescued and we could not take them. So, and that's devastating to know that there's animals that need help and can't get it because we don't have the space for them. We don't have the capacity for it. So this came out of necessity, not because we wanted to be feeding them.
can you discuss the overall population trends specifically within the Indian River Lagoon? Maybe even in light of the small rebounds we're seeing in seagrass?
So I can tell you what I know, but manatees, it's very hard to kind of know exactly what's going on in the population, because even when we do the aerial flights to count animals, you're not catching them all. They're hanging out in the mangrove forests where we can't see them. They're underwater. So it's always an estimate. And before the unusual mortality event happened, FWC had put out an estimate, a new estimate for the number of animals in the state. And the general idea was thought there were around 10,000 statewide before the unusual mortality event. We personally think that it's less than that. That in general, before that, it was around 8,000. So that would be around 4,000 on each coast. But it's an estimate, and a lot of that comes from population modeling. We do know that we lost over 12% of the entire Atlantic coast population in about a year. So that's really devastating for them. But we're seeing the number of calves go up for sure. We're definitely seeing that. So we know that they're rebounding, and the Mosquito Lagoon in the northernmost part of the IRL has lush seagrass beds, and manatees are in good body condition there. They're seen regularly feeding there. And we're seeing grasses come back in the Banana River and in parts of the southern IRL as well. So everything looks like the trend would be going upwards, but it is hard to know for certain.
Yeah. So we have a question about getting involved with working with manatees, releasing manatees, and volunteer opportunities.
So if you are interested in volunteering with FWC, that's one of the main groups that would be doing the rescue and release. I would go on their website and look at the manatee rescue portion of it. They have opportunities listed up there, and you can learn more about how to get involved. There are a lot of organizations that are doing this, that are part of this, but FWC is the biggest statewide, and they have multiple field labs across the state. Clearwater Marine Aquarium Research Institute does a lot of the tagging and research, that looking at where manatees are going. So you could look into getting involved on their website as well. A lot of what we're doing specifically is the advocacy. So seeing the trends in the population or areas where areas where there needs to be additional speed zones or reviewing management plans, but we also do a lot of fundraising, and that fundraising goes specifically towards protecting manatees and those efforts. You can always reach out to us on our website as well to learn more about opportunities and what's going on in the manatee world.
Excellent. If anybody else has any other questions, drop them in real quick. Otherwise, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and your knowledge with us today. And so we can kind of go on and share the education with others.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.